Welcome to Revenge with Arya. My name is Maya Ellison, 31 years old. And if you think the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally are incapable of gutting you alive, then you've never met my sister. 7 years ago, she looked me dead in the eyes across our parents' kitchen table and said the words I still hear in the quiet before sleep. You were always the charity case of this family, the mistake they kept out of obligation. And her husband sat right beside her, nodding like she'd just read scripture. My parents sat at the heads of that table and said absolutely nothing. Not one word, not a single defense. They just looked down at their plates like the truth was somewhere in their food, and let her words hang in the air like smoke. I was 24. I had just been voted out of the company my father built, the company I had poured 4 years of my life into, the company where I had worked 60-hour weeks while my sister showed up at noon smelling like brunch and left by 3. But she was married to David Harmon, and David Harmon had convinced my father that the business needed new strategic direction, that I was a liability, that my ideas were too risky, my presence too disruptive. What he really meant was that I had found the accounting discrepancies, the ones that pointed directly at him. So they removed me instead. I left that kitchen with nothing but a duffel bag, $2,000 in my savings account, and a silence so loud it followed me all the way to the studio apartment I could barely afford. No calls from my parents. No texts from my sister asking if I was okay. 7 years of nothing. Not for my birthday. Not for the holidays. Not when I got sick. Not when I rebuilt myself from the ground up. 7 years of being treated like I had never existed at all. But time does something interesting when you stop wasting it on people who don't deserve it. It compounds. Every hour I used to spend trying to earn their approval became an hour I spent building something real. I went back to school nights and weekends. I networked relentlessly. I pitched my ideas to anyone who would listen until I found the people who actually would. By 27, I had co-founded a logistics software company with 2 partners I trusted more than anyone in my bloodline. By 29, we had secured Series B funding. By 31, we had 400 employees, clients in 11 states, and a headquarters in the same downtown district where my father's company had its offices. The same district. 4 blocks away. I want you to understand something about the life I built. It wasn't built on anger. Anger burns clean and fast and leaves you empty. What I built it on was clarity. The absolute crystal clear understanding of exactly what I was worth and exactly what they had thrown away. Every morning I walked into my office on the 14th floor, I thought about that kitchen table. And then I thought about the folder I had kept. Every document, every email, every financial record I had quietly copied before they escorted me out. Because I had found those discrepancies for a reason, and I had never stopped paying attention. I was at my desk on a Tuesday morning when my assistant told me I had unscheduled visitors in the lobby. No appointment, she said, a little uncertain. They say they're family. I didn't rush down. I finished the email I was writing, poured a second cup of coffee, and pulled up the lobby camera feed on my laptop. There they were. My sister, thinner than I remembered, her designer bag looking slightly worn at the corners. Her husband David, his jaw tight, his posture carrying the particular stiffness of a man who was used to walking into rooms like he owned them but had recently forgotten how that felt. And behind them, my parents, my mother gripping her purse with both hands, my father staring at the floor. 7 years. And they walked into my lobby like it had been a long weekend. I let them wait 22 minutes. Then I rode the elevator down. My sister saw me first. Her face did something complicated, cycling through relief and entitlement and something that almost looked like shame before she settled on a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Maya, you look wonderful. I looked at all 4 of them slowly, the way you look at something you're deciding whether to pick up off the ground. Then I looked at my assistant. Please have security escort our guests to the 2nd floor conference room. I'll be up in a moment. I gave them another 10 minutes to sit in that glass-walled room with nothing but water and the view of the city before I walked in. I sat down across from them, folded my hands on the table, and waited. My sister spoke first. We need your help. Of course they did. David's company had collapsed. Not slowly, not gracefully, but spectacularly. The kind of collapse that makes the local business section and gets whispered about at the kinds of dinners my parents used to attend. 3 lawsuits, 2 of them from former partners. An IRS audit that had apparently uncovered some of those same discrepancies I had flagged 7 years ago, except now they had a name on them and consequences attached. They had lost the house. They had burned through whatever my parents had tried to lend them. My father's original company, the one I had been removed from, had been quietly absorbed into a competitor for pennies after David ran it into the ground with a strategy he had apparently borrowed from a self-help book. My parents had moved in with my sister and David 6 months ago. Now they all needed somewhere to go. My mother reached across the table and put her hand over mine. "You're the only one who made it, sweetheart. You're the only one we can turn to. Sweetheart." I looked down at her hand on mine for a long moment. The last time she had called me that was at that kitchen table, right before she looked away. I said, "I need to think about it. Give me a few days." That was the first move. What I didn't tell them was that thinking about it was the last thing I needed to do. I had been thinking about this moment for 7 years. What I needed were 48 hours to make 3 phone calls. The first call was to my attorney. The second was to a journalist I'd had lunch with twice over the past year, a woman who covered corporate accountability and had been quietly interested in the story of David Harmon's business practices for some time. The third call was to the venue coordinator for the quarterly investor dinner I hosted every season, because I had an adjustment to make to the guest list. My sister called me twice during those 2 days. I didn't answer. On the third day, I called her back and told her I had a proposal for them and that I'd like to discuss it in a more appropriate setting than my office. I was hosting a small dinner that Friday evening at the Meridian Club downtown. Would they come? She said yes before I finished the sentence. What my sister didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the Meridian dinner was not small. 43 people. Investors, board members, 2 city council contacts, a handful of journalists, former colleagues of my father's who remembered him from the years when his reputation still meant something. People who had watched David Harmon move through their circles and had quietly filed things away. I spent Thursday evening going through the folder, the one I had kept all 7 years. I added to it everything that had surfaced in the lawsuit filings and the audit documents that were now public record. I had it formatted cleanly, professionally, and I gave a copy to my attorney and a summary to the journalist with the understanding that she would verify independently and publish in her own time and on her own judgment. Friday evening. I wore a navy dress that cost more than my first month's rent on that studio apartment. The room was warm, candlelit, the kind of atmosphere that makes people relax and say things they might not otherwise say. I made sure my family was seated at a table with a clear sightline to the presentation screen. I made sure David was between 2 people who had lost money connected to his ventures. I made sure my mother was seated next to a woman who had been friends with her 20 years ago and had heard a very particular version of my departure from the family company. Dinner was served. Wine was poured. The room was everything it should have been. At the 40-minute mark, I stood and thanked everyone for coming. I said that this quarter had been one of reflection for me, both professionally and personally. I said that I believed in transparency and that accountability was something I tried to build into every structure in my life. And then I nodded to my tech director, and the screen behind me lit up. I had titled it simply, The Record. It was not a spectacle. It was not dramatic music or theatrical narration. It was documents. Clean, dated, sourced. Financial transfers that showed how David had moved money out of my father's company in the 18 months before it went under. Emails between David and 2 of the former partners now suing him that showed he had known about the exposure and said nothing. A side-by-side comparison of the projections he had presented to investors against the internal numbers he had actually been working with. The accounting discrepancies I had flagged at 24, now annotated with what had happened to those funds over the following 7 years. And at the end, quietly, a single page. My termination letter, dated 7 years ago. Signed by my father, with a handwritten note in the margin in David's handwriting that read, "She knows too much, move fast." The room was silent in a way that felt physical. I watched a man across the room, set down his fork very carefully, the way people do when they need a moment to process. I watched a woman who had been my mother's friend 20 years ago turn and look at my mother with an expression I will never forget. I watched David's jaw go rigid, his hands flat on the table. My sister looked at me, and I saw it, the moment she understood that this was not a dinner. This was the document. I raised my glass. Thank you all for being part of this chapter, and for understanding why some doors, once closed, should stay that way. The applause started slowly, and then wasn't slow anymore. I didn't look at my family's table again that night. The fallout began before I got home. My phone was ringing before my car pulled out of the parking garage, my sister's name on the screen. Then my mother's. Then a number I didn't recognize that turned out to be my father, calling from someone else's phone because I had blocked his months ago on instinct. I turned the screen face down on the passenger seat and drove home through the quiet city with the windows down. By Saturday morning, 2 of the people at that dinner had reached out to the journalist independently. By Sunday, she told me she had enough to move forward on her own timeline. By Monday, the story was live. Not a hit piece, not a vendetta, just sourced, documented. Accurate reporting on a pattern of financial misconduct that had hurt a number of people over a number of years. My sister called 14 times that day. I listened to the voicemails without picking up. Her voice moved through the stages like weather, first sharp and accusing. You had no right. You humiliated this family. Then cracking. Maya, please. We have nowhere. The kids need stability. Then, by the 9th message, something I had never heard from her before. Something that sounded, underneath all the desperation, like the beginning of understanding what she had actually done. I didn't call back. By Wednesday, they showed up at my building. I got the alert from my building security while I was in a meeting. 4 individuals at the main entrance, no appointment, claiming family emergency. I asked security to tell them I was unavailable and to offer them the address of a nearby hotel. My sister apparently responded to this by sitting down in the lobby and refusing to leave for 2 hours until my building manager called the non-emergency police line and an officer came to escort them out. The officer took a report. I had my attorney send a formal notice that afternoon. Any further unannounced visits to my place of residence or place of business would be treated as harassment. They didn't come back to my office. They came to my building at 7 in the morning on a Thursday instead. I was leaving for an early meeting when I walked out of the elevator and found my sister standing in the lobby with my parents, all 3 of them looking like they had been awake for days. My sister's eyes were red. My father looked like a man who had physically shrunk since I last stood next to him. My mother, when she saw me, pressed her hand to her mouth. My building manager gave me a look. I nodded. Let me handle it. I walked toward them slowly. I didn't rush, and I didn't stop far away. I stood close enough that I could see my mother's mascara from yesterday still faint beneath her eyes. My father spoke first. He had always controlled rooms by speaking first. But his voice when it came out was not the voice of a man who controlled anything. It was just an old man's voice, quiet and unsteady. Maya, I made a mistake. More than one. I know that doesn't cover it. I looked at him for a long time. He said, David told me you had stolen from the company. That you were the one falsifying numbers. I believed him. I should have looked at the evidence myself. I should have looked at you. The lobby was quiet. The security guard was looking at his desk very deliberately. I said, yes, you should have. My mother stepped forward. She didn't touch me. She just stood close. Please. I don't know what to do. I don't know where we're going after this. My sister was last. She looked at me with something that I think, in another life, in a version of us that had gone differently, would have been the beginning of a real conversation. She said, I knew about what David was doing. Not everything, but enough. I told myself it was just business. I let you take the blame because it was easier. And I called you the charity case because I was the one who was scared. The lobby was very still. Here is what I felt in that moment. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Not the clean, sharp relief I had imagined on 100 tired evenings in that first studio apartment when I ate cereal for dinner and studied until 2 in the morning. What I felt was something closer to grief. Because standing in front of me were not monsters. They were just people who had made choices, small and large, over years, that had led them all the way here, to a lobby on a Thursday morning, humiliated and asking the person they had discarded to be the one to catch them. I had spent 7 years becoming someone who didn't need them to catch me. I had never figured out who I would be if the moment ever actually arrived. I said, I'm not going to give you money. I'm not going to give David anything. But I made some calls earlier this week. There's a transitional housing nonprofit that I sit on the board of. They have a family unit available for 60 days. That gives you enough time to make a real plan. I've already told them to expect your call. After that, it's up to you. My mother made a sound I can't fully describe. I looked at my sister. What you said to me in that kitchen. What you let happen. I'm not going to pretend that didn't matter because you're standing here now. But I'm also not going to be the reason you're on the street. Those are two different things. Do you understand? She nodded. She was crying now. I said, I have to go. I have a 7 o'clock. I walked past them to the door. My hand pushed against the glass. The morning air came in cool and clean. I didn't look back. Not because I was cold. Because I had already said everything I needed to say, and looking back would have been for their comfort, not mine. And for the first time in 7 years, I was done arranging myself around their comfort. The case my attorney filed moved forward on its own. David faced civil suits from 3 parties and a separate IRS proceeding. He and my sister separated 8 months later. My parents, from what I understand, eventually stabilized. My father started volunteering at a small business mentorship program 2 days a week. My mother sent me a letter, handwritten, 4 pages, that I read once and put in a drawer. Not because it meant nothing, but because I needed time to decide what to do with it. I didn't reach out to my sister again. Not because the door was sealed with anger, but because trust is not a light switch. It's something that gets built over years with consistent action, and we hadn't started yet. Maybe we would. Maybe we wouldn't. What I know is this. I walk into my office on the 14th floor every morning, and I think about a girl who sat at a kitchen table at 24 and heard the word obligation used to describe her existence. And I think about everything she built in the silence they handed her. The 400 people who have jobs because of something she created. The scholarship fund I started last year for first-generation college students in our city because I know what it feels like to have no one in your corner. The life that I made from scratch because scratch was all they left me. They called me the charity case. The mistake. The liability. But I was the only one still standing. Not because I was harder than them, or colder, or more ruthless. But because when they closed that door, I stopped knocking on it and built my own. That's the thing they never understood. They thought they were taking something from me when they cut me out. They didn't understand that they were setting me free. Revenge. Real revenge isn't a scene. It isn't a confrontation or a clever line or watching someone crumble at your feet. It's the life you build when you stop begging for a seat at a table that was never meant for you, and you go find the lumber and build your own. It's the Tuesday morning when you realize you haven't thought about them in 2 weeks. It's the full night of sleep without a single dream about a kitchen table and a silence that lasted 7 years. It's this. Right now. The quiet that lives in the space where their voices used to be. I was never the charity case. I was the one who taught myself the lesson they thought they were using to break me. And if they ever truly understand what they had and what they chose to throw away, then they've already received the only sentence that matters.